Tenakoto katoa. Welcome to the SOLA seminar. Today we have one of our own SOLA members presenting the seminar. So Wendy McWilliam, the floor is yours. So please ask any questions you have at the end of the presentation. Online people, feel free to use the chat box or open your mics at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, for coming today. And yeah.
Thank you, Nada. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is about the process of designing, but it's also about how to research through design. So scholars here at Lincoln and in other universities in the world not only do, talk about, teach design, do design, but we also research. So the question is always, how do we research and embed design into a research process? And at the same time, when we're designing, how do we take advantage of the qualities of research and embed that in the design outcomes? So that's really something that's been talked about in our profession, I'd say, for the last 20 years. It came up about 20 years ago. Scholarship started coming out to talk about the need to embed evidence in the design process to support our design decisions so that we can be ensured that when we design something in the landscape, that it meets the objectives that we've set for ourselves, and that we don't inadvertently design something that actually could be damaging to people's health, damaging to the environment, by mistake, maybe, because we haven't sufficiently embedded research outputs and facts into our design. So this is what I'm going to talk about today is experiences that my colleagues and I have had. Andreas, have you met Dr. Wesener? So he's here, he's the head of school. He was working with me on this design studio. Anupriya, Sukumar, who's one of my PhD students, and we've based the studio project we took on her work as a PhD student. And then I have a colleague in Texas who's a professor down there, and he started this, he was one of the pioneers of this movement 20 years ago, and is a micro climate designer. So that's what he does. So this kind of work process of teaching design comes out of his work. So what is compelling us to think about how important it is to embed design in the process comes out of things like the extremely serious environmental challenges we have today, but there are also many socioeconomic challenges, all sorts of different challenges we face, which are influenced by what we design in the landscape. So this is Rockstrom's work from 2009. It's a very powerful image. It's depicting, we've got the Earth, and he's identified 9 different environmental systems that are currently very, very important systems which support ecosystem function in the world. And here the green circle is the kind of the limits within the in which we can operate for conducting these systems. And he's suggesting that there's at least 3 here: biodiversity loss, climate change, and nitrogen cycles, which are outside the current limits at the moment, right? So the current moment, we're outside the limits that we need to be. And this creates really serious risk for human well-being in the future. So the idea is we can't really afford to take chances when we're designing the landscape that we might contribute to these problems instead of leading solutions. So when it comes to design, I often see this kind of design. This is just something I downloaded from the internet. This is a park design, a so-called ecological park in Africa. And they use things like nature, creating nature, a gradual transition from nature to artificial environment of the city. And this is the kind of imaging they have behind this. Does this look healthy to you? This is the question, right? They're trying to say this is an ecological park indicating health, right, and well-being. They've got like wildlife here, you know, animals and people all nice and happy. Everybody's happy. It's nice and green. Got these beautiful flower beds. And the question is, when you see that, what do you see? Is this a healthy landscape, right? It's cueing you with these images in here that this is very healthy, right? So you have to be able to read the landscape to determine whether is this actual health or is this greenwashing? Is it green sheen or is it actually green authentically? We don't want to fool ourselves into creating problems, right, that are, you know, contributing to these big problems in the world by creating things which we think are really healthy and clean, but they're not. Okay. So, you know, posing questions like, you know, we got, you know, rain falling on this landscape, and there are certain pesticides and herbicides being used to maintain this landscape, right? These things don't just happen. You see this bed here, which is very homogeneous. That's not something that generally occurs naturally in nature. You have a very green, homogeneous lawn. You don't see any dandelions, weeds, and things. Well, that maintenance regime in a rainstorm is going to run down, and where is it going to go, right? Into this water body. We've got a fairly steep grade here, and you don't have anything much to filter the water. So you're going to end up with a polluted body of water here if you're not very careful, right? But this is the this kind of landscape has very high amount of artificial inputs. Water, all sorts of chemical use, a lot of maintenance, picking out weeds and stuff out of things, fossil fuel use, mowing the grass, etc. This isn't a particularly healthy landscape. It looks healthy, but I would, you know, if I were to do an audit, I would say it isn't. So we want to make sure that when we design something, it's not fooling us into thinking it's the way to go. So how do we do that? We try to embed some research into what we're trying to do. So there's two parts to this idea of designing through research is one way of putting it. That's what the Europeans use, that term. And then we have the North Americans using evidence-based design. Basically, it's the use of scholarly evidence in making decisions about the use and shaping of the land. What is that scholarly evidence? It can be through a critical lit review on a particular topic, so that we're picking up the knowledge of experts about, say, water filtration and how to design that in the landscape. It can be through what we call projection, which is this simulation of our design results. So we are got tools out there that we can test our designs to see whether they actually achieve our results. We can do that too. That's a different type of evidence. And through that process, you're coming up with an ultimate design product, which is your best guess, or kind of like a design hypothesis of what you think it can achieve, that it achieves your ends based on that kind of evidence. That's what we do in a studio, right? We can't really test it out in the field. We're not implementing it. We really don't have the ability to go out and measure things in the field in a studio. So really, this is the step that we're doing. So we're trying to, through our design process in studios, come up with the best we can do with evidence embedded in it. The second part of it is through practice. So when you go out in practice, you're going to start implementing your design, and you want to monitor it to determine whether it actually achieved your objectives or not. So it's kind of like part two of the whole process. then what happens at the end of that is, out of the lessons you learned from monitoring, you then you might go out and fix your design, right? Retrofit it. Or the next design you take on, you bring forward those lessons and you improve your design and embed more evidence in it so that we have this circular process and we have, in the end, improved design through time so that as practitioners, we are actually doing what we say we're going to do. So that's the two parts. We're not taking this on, but I mention it to you because there's a whole body of research about what practitioners are doing and not doing in terms of this evidence-based design, but we're just looking at the first part. So the next thing I want to discuss is this is not the only way to do evidence-based design or to embed research into our design process. This is only kind of more my way because I only follow positivistic research strategy. That's the kind of strategy I do in research. So this method is only based on that. There are different methods of doing research, different strategies that need to be embedded in this process. So this is just about what I do, because what I do in research is I take on more technical, functional, environmental type projects in research. So this is the process I use. And I view largely when I design, I'm thinking about setting up a hypothesis based on the evidence that I have kind of gathered during my design process and to be tested, and then I measure its effects to determine the best design I can. So when I do that through this projection, so spatial modeling, using simulation modeling, GIS, these different tools that we have available, and then through monitoring, once I can go out in the field and I can measure things also through monitoring. And then I evaluate my design through these kind of standard research methods, criteria for determining its validity. So the idea with embedding research into the design process is to have a methodology that has where design is a core component, but it also complies with standard research methodological criteria for what is a good methodology. So that's the idea of it. So when I started this process, been doing this for a while, what this kind of shows is kind of an evolution here. This top box is kind of where I started. So this is how I learned when I did studios as an undergrad. This is kind of how the studio was set up. And then this is the way I taught for a few years after I graduated with my PhD, because that's how I learned. So in this process, you've got a fairly short studio project. Usually they're about a month. So you can have 3 studio projects in a term. Sometimes they go as long as 6 weeks, so then you have 2. But in any case, they're fairly short. And you usually come in with a design brief. And then you quickly, like within a week, you're out in the field doing an inventory and analysis of a site. And then you're into the whole design stage of coming up with new ideas of how to solve a problem. And then you hand it in, right? So that's how I started. But what I found was, and I got to say, at that stage, I was just saying to students, look, you need evidence. Go out and find the evidence. Go and do a lit review and figure it out and bring it in and make sure your design is, got some evidence behind it. And I thought, and I was kind of scratching my head, why aren't they coming up with anything? Why isn't it enough? It's lots of great ideas, but when I asked them, where does this idea, what are you trying to do here? Why have you got the riparian corridor on this side of the river that wide? Is there a reason behind that? And, usually it's, well, I don't know, it looked like a good thing to do. So what I decided then is to have a much longer studio project. Now this model here comes out of the work of Milburn and Brown, 2003 when this movement was just starting. And it's much longer process, okay? It includes a research phase, so it's largely here. And then you've got a kind of more artistic inspiration, a design stage here. And then you has another research stage here, which is more about assessment. So you got the pre-design information gathering, which can include things like a lit review, can include inventory analysis, so inventory, like kind of collecting information. Then you have a design phase where you're exploring concepts. And in the end, what you're doing is testing the concept, usually against your research phase up front. You evaluate it and you come up with an ultimate solution. This waving thing is to try to weave the creativity of the process in with the technical aspects so that you don't lose either one. And the idea of this is when you have research at the top here, it means that's the predominant mode of operation during this phase. There's still some artistic inspiration happening, but it's kind of suppressed. In this stage, you've got the artistic inspiration being in the forefront and driving the process. And then in here again, you got the research popping up at the end. Now, how does this work? They never really discussed it. This was kind of like a conceptual model of how it could be done, but is an attempt to try to understand the different parts of the process of how you would embed research and design into a process together. This one is got the end monitoring stage. So it has research up front, you got a design, you got an assessment stage, and then this is the point in which your design hypothesis would end. And then you're out in the field. Once it's implemented, you monitor it, and then again, you're back to research. So it's a circular process where you're working, scholars are basically working with practitioners to advance problem solving in the field. That's the whole idea behind it. So for this is what bringing up the lessons learned from this studio. You folks that are in second year or in the 240 master's program, you might be having this studio next term. It includes, it's one studio project over the whole term. And I started off with it being quite short, but then it was like, oh, we ran out of time. We don't have enough time. And then all of a sudden, in order to encompass all the different stages of the process, it ended up taking up the whole semester. The first part of the project is for about a month, you review and summarize this evidential theory in the scientific literature. So this is a whole month before you even go out in the field and look at a specific site. The idea here is to look at information about the problems that you're trying to solve and to come up with generalized information of how to solve it, okay? So that was the first step. And then students hand in an output at this point. The second one is, okay, now we know these broad generalized information about how to solve it according to the literature. What is happening on the specific site? Okay, so then it's inventory and analysis time, and you're comparing what's going on the site with what you've generated in terms of your generalized knowledge. So you're comparing, and the idea is to say, to what extent does what's going on the site meet what we need to happen to solve this problem, and where does it fall down? Okay, so that you know at the end of that what you've got to retrofit, what do you got to change to solve the problem, and what can you keep in place, right? What do you do in this specific situation? So that's output 2, where you're comparing your output, your second stage without this, what you come up with in stage 1. Then you've got the whole creative process coming in. So based on that knowledge, you're into creative problem solving mode, coming up with alternative ways of solving the problem based on both this generalized knowledge and also the site-specific information. You're testing it back and forward. So you're comparing it in your mind And that we have is the output 3, which is the actual design. And then 4th stage is the evaluation of the design. So looking at what you've come up with and comparing it with what you started with, which is your inventory and analysis, okay? And you're comparing and saying, to what extent did I meet my objectives? Okay, so that's how the whole process works. So what did we learn? We did this over about 3 years. So we perfected this process using the same project over 3 years with input from the feedback from the students throughout the whole time. What we found was that students and we didn't know much about the topics that we were addressing when we started. So I would start with some project I didn't know really much about. Okay, it wasn't my research focus, but sometimes projects come about from the community and they say, why don't you take on this project for us? This is a good one. And you go, okay, that sounds good. Or, you know, you might come up with something in your head and go, oh, there's a good project. But then I realized that it's very difficult to do evidence-based design when you don't know much about it, right? And it's impossible for you to do it if I'm not an expert, because I can't help you very easily. You're just, you know, you're experimenting, and so am I. I'm learning as I go. If you think about other fields across the campus, you would be taught all sorts of theoretical information behind that. It's like soil science or whatever it is. And then you'd be given a project to do based on that knowledge. So what are we doing in the classroom here is we're saying, you don't have any knowledge, but go solve the problem. It's really what you're being asked to do, right? That's a very difficult starting point. So it's much more advanced what we're asking you to do than any other student on campus, I would say, because we're asking you to solve problems of which you don't have hardly any background to answer. Some master's students come in with other degrees. So if you happen to pick a project where they have knowledge in that, they're advantaged, right? But most of the time you're taking on projects you don't know much about. Very difficult. Some students, or a lot of them, don't know how to do a critical literature review, which is a very specific type where you withhold judgment when you're reviewing literature and you say, you know, is this good research? Is it valid? Is it high quality, right? It's not just a Google, a Wikipedia page where you don't really know who's provided that information. So you need to be able to know how to do that. A lot of scientific papers don't provide evidence that's spatial, okay? It's in formulas, numbers, could be text, and you're left thinking, what does it mean for spatial design? If you can't make that translation, it won't do you any good. That was another thing we found. Often the evidence you need is missing. So that's the other thing. There's no perfect knowledge out there. Some of it's there and some of it's not. What do you do when it's missing, right? Make it up. What do you do? So those are the kind of the 4 key things about stage 1 that we learned. So what did we do about it? We decided we'd only take on design problems in which we have expertise. So now I just picked projects where I have research expertise in so that I can help you as much as possible. The downside of that is we often hire tutors who come from outside, who are generalist practitioners, who don't have the expertise. So what do? That is a challenge of this model of teaching, right? It means you got to teach them. But now we have tutors who have been doing the studio for several years, same project, they know now the stuff. But at first, it's tricky, right? What do you do about that? We give students a leg up. So this addresses this problem of them coming in with not much knowledge. So we give them a lecture from experts about the topic. We help them understand the variables behind solutions to a problem so that they understand where to focus their lit review. We give them a little brief summary of the literature with references behind it to try to get them started in their critical lit review. We provide them with a very specific design goal. Sometimes when you get a brief, it's kind of vague, right? It's like, oh, this is happening. What do you want to do? What's your goal in your design? You got to make it up yourself, right? And what happens often with students is they're thinking big. So it's like, I want a sustainable this, and I want a resilient that, and I want a healthy this and spiritual that, right? Goals, big goals. Well, every one of those goals has a massive literature review behind it, right? And different ways of interpreting those things. What's sustainability? You know, if I asked you all what that was, you'd give me completely different answers. So we give the design goal, we give the key variables involved with solving the problem. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute. And we talk about how to organize the variables in a hierarchy, because often problem solving is about different levels and how things are related. So we talk about that. We teach how to do a critical lit review, what's good literature. You know, there's a whole hierarchy. We also teach a specific tool for providing your own evidence when it's missing, so that you can show that it works, right? You can show the shade in place and where it needs to be. We also decided the output for this particular part of the project is design guidelines. So you are translating the literature and the theory into spatial forms toward a document that could be used by a landscape architect to solve a problem in many ways. That's guidelines are not meant to provide solutions to designers. They're meant to provide some information that is generalized based on a literature review, a critical lit review, to allow them to make solutions that could be a whole variety of solutions which meet the generalized theory that is outlined in the guideline. So this is what the students came up with. So this is just the table of contents of this particular project. This one is about protecting children in schoolyards from overexposure to the sun, okay? Because it causes cancer later in life. And New Zealand has one of the highest skin cancer rates in the world because of a whole variety of reasons. But that's the situation. Children are particularly susceptible up to the age of 18. They get most of their exposure to UVR at that time. They have very thin skin, especially young children. And so that's the time to protect them. So how do we design schoolyards which protect them from overexposure? We identified 3 variables involved with solving that. One is you have to block UVR, direct UVR, that's the stuff that's coming right at you from the sun. Indirect UVR, which is that which bounces off a wall and hits you, right? If you have a white wall and you're standing behind it, even if you're in the shade, it can bounce off that wall and hit you. Thermal comfort is another thing that has to be in place, because even if you've got protection from UVR, direct and indirect, and there's something interesting to do, if people are freezing cold or boiling hot, they won't stay there, okay? So that's the second variable. And the third one is having something interesting, compelling for kids to do, okay? We can only design for behavior. It's kind of like setting the table, providing lots of food on the table to choose from. We can't force kids into the shade. We have to make sure that they're going to places because we've met their needs, and those places are protected, okay? That's the approach. So we gave them, this indicates they've done all these different guidelines for how to protect from direct UVR, indirect, thermal comfort, provide the activities, etc. And they had to do it at 3 spatial scales. Components like trees, which provide shade, activity areas, and whole schoolyard. So we did it at 3 spatial scales. the guideline you get on one page. So we taught them also how to do a good guideline. What are the components of it? And that was the criteria for assessment. And they used their spatial modeling. So you see, this is through spatial modeling using a Google SketchUp, showing the results of different types of, say, foliage density on shading. And in Google SketchUp, you can play at different times of the day, different times of the year, and you can set it in New Zealand right here because it's different. The modeling outputs would be different elsewhere in the world. So there are tools you can use to generate your own evidence. Stage B, they go out in the field and do your inventory and analysis. So we had difficulties there with identifying design objectives. So the idea is once you have your goal, we want this behavior, what are the specific things you need to do in the design to meet your goal? So students had a difficult time understanding that, coming up with goals or objectives that were specific enough so that they knew what to inventory. That's really the question. We taught this 3D modeling, but it didn't help determine the targets. So one of the things you have to do, which would be desirable, is once your design's in place, how do you determine if the variables are adequately in place? If the objectives you've met adequately protect children? How much shade is needed? Is it 50% cover of an activity area? Is it 75%? How do you determine that as a target in order to say kids are adequately protected? If you can't come up with targets, what you can say is we provided 50% more shade, and that's certainly a good achievement, but you don't really know whether they're protected. That's a tricky one, but what we did was we helped the students come up with targets. Also, the modeling was good at showing where shade was in place, for example, but it didn't help us determine how all three variables were in the same space. In order to support the behavior, all three need to be present. So what do we do about that? So we taught, what we did in response is we taught the specific and spatially relevant design objectives. So we worked a lot at that. And then following that, we came up with a very simple way of trying to ensure that inventory collected in the field was related to achieving the objectives, which were related to the goal. So that's how it works. You have a goal, you break it down to what do I need to achieve to meet the goal. And for each goal, you come up with a list of inventory you need to take to determine the extent to which your site meets the objective. And the whole thing is kind of works together. So we taught that. We developed targets together. Often the targets are missing from the literature. This is the problem with scientific literature. You don't know whether the evidence is going to be there. So we did our best to come up with targets. And then we taught another method of how to layer up the spatially the components supporting the three variables in one place so we could determine where they were met and where they weren't met. Oh, these are kind of outputs here. Henley might recognize this is Henley's excellent work when he was in my studio. It was, I don't know how long ago it was. I could be about 5 years or so. I don't know. Yeah, but you did a great job. Did you win a prize for this work?
Yeah.
Yeah, won a prize, an international prize for this work. So this is Henley's work, his inventory and analysis of the schoolyard that we set. So it shows this is kind of like shading and level of shading, different times of the day, looked at different activities going on. This is a wind diagram looking at the effects of this shelter belt that's along this side and how the different vegetation affects and buildings affect the wind. This is about thermal comfort. This is another student's work, looking at this layering idea. So this is another tool for measuring the degree to which all three variables are in the same place. So the previous one is very good, but it really breaks down the variables independently. So they're not showing where all three variables come together. They just show us an independent valuation of the variables. So this method here, which is very quite common, but is rarely used at the site scale. So this method of layering up was done a long time ago. I don't know if it was even back in the 60s. Was Ian McHarg was the one who made it famous for landscape architecture. This idea of coming up with where are different biophysical capabilities, what is needed in the soil or in the landscape to support a particular land use, you map it and you see where those biophysical resources are in place. So we used it at the site scale, but it was a highly complicated method. So I would say it wasn't for everybody, but it was effective at measuring how the variables came together in the same space. So the design phase. So the design phase was very easy for some and tricky for others. I guess there's students who really shine in more the technical stuff, the analytical work, the kind of lit reviews, the scholarly stuff. Then there's the real designer focused ones who really shine in that, but really don't like too much. It's hard work for them to do the critical. So you get this whole spectrum of students. Some students who are in the, more the technical side, the better at academics, had trouble transitioning into the more creative works, right? So they got so focused on that side of their brain that they had a hard time kind of loosening up. And now, we now need to do some brainstorming. How do we solve this problem? Knowing what we know in all different ways to come up with an ideal solution. And that was tricky for some. And what we learned is there are creativity skills. You can build up that ability to think creatively and come up with new ideas. But it's something you have to work on, okay? So it is a skill that you can build. This was essential for meeting the attractive activity variable on it. I think it was hard for students to take on all three variables at first, so they accomplished the first two variables in the earlier parts of this process, but this creativity side really helped them do this attractive activity variable. And then it enabled the application of this generalized principles to be applied to specific places. So going through this process, the front end, really allowed students the freedom to be able to understand those generalized principles of what they have to achieve and be able to mix them up in different ways and very creative ways across the site. So it did not, in other words, prevent creative thinking and creative problem solving. This is what we did to solve the problem with the creative exercises. We came up with, in the beginning of each several studio settings or times, different exercises. So this one is by Noam Chomsky of MIT, Think Like a Child. So basically we set up these ways of coming up with new ideas. Okay, put yourself in the mind of a child. Here's a problem, come up with new ways to solve it. We worked in groups, big sheets of paper, big markers, came up with all sorts of things. Sometimes I bring in a big basket of weird stuff, springs, all sorts of weird things, and say, solve this problem using these, different items to try to get those skills doing. But there are many, many ways to generate new ideas that you can use. Another thing from Henley. So this was his ultimate design. Very, very creative. Okay, compared to, see, the original site. Let's go back a bit, which basically looks like that. It's got like a field here. It's got, this is all kind of paint on the pavement. with one tree here and a bit of vegetation around the buildings. But basically, this was all hard structure. Looked more like one of people commenting on the design of these schools. They look a bit like more like prison camps, where they're wanting to minimize the elements so that they can supervise, you know, with minimum number of people. It's easy to maintain, clean, all those things. Different reasons behind their design, but the big difference between what Henley came up with, this absolutely gorgeous, very interesting design, very creative, very rich, and yet still highly evidence-based. So the last stage was the evaluation. So looking back at Henley's design and comparing it with the original schoolyard and measuring it for the 3 variables that we set. And here's his evaluation of the before and the after. So you can see how much more shade was created. And if you read this, a tremendous detail, which Henley is widely known for, you will see how superior his final design was after going through this process, and in the end won this international award. So there you go. That's what Henley was able to achieve, and we were thrilled with his work. So the conclusions, the 4 phases with interrelated outputs, so with each output building on the next, worked really well, but the devil's in the details. So when we started off the process, learning from colleagues who were doing it in the Netherlands, they came up with a very general way of doing the process, but we found through this iterative approach, we really had to refine it to enable students to take it on, okay? The tools for creating your own evidence we found to be crucial to the process, and the design evaluation also crucial. The first years we weren't requiring evaluation, and then students kind of forgot about the early stages in the process, did a creative job, but then when I asked, okay, where's your shade difference, right? Like, how did you accomplish your objectives? They kind of forgot to do that part. And so the evaluation becomes essential, and giving it an actual grade is also a good idea. I think it caters to specialty or versus generalist designers. I think that you really requires you to have a very in-depth knowledge of your research area to teach this design, but it also has me wondering what we do, what's its implications for practitioners who are generalists, who are coming at design. Like normally, you know, someone's calling you up as a landscape architect saying, I've got this project, can you do it? And you're not going to say, oh, I don't have any expertise in that. You're going to say, sure, when can I come over, right? That's how a lot of landscape architects, they're not going to, you know, send away work. And so they're starting at that point of not knowing, right? So what does it mean what does it mean for practice, this kind of approach? We do have specialist practitioners. It's going to be a lot more suitable for them. I guess that's at the moment anyway. The teaching is quite intensive. It's not just, you know, you can do what you want. We're going to circulate around, do desk crits. We have to constantly kind of give guidance, skill development throughout, all sorts of things. And it's quite advanced, I would say. It's quite advanced process of design. In part, we do it because we want to prepare you in your 3rd year, at the final semester of your 3rd year, for 4th year design, where we have quite high expectations. And I'm happy to say the results out of the 4th year projects are just out of this world, are fantastic. So we are trying to teach you at an advanced level, but it is a challenging process for everyone concerned, this particular way of designing. Next steps, we're going to try to simplify it, perhaps fewer variables, maybe too many variables, and then one testing method versus the maybe not doing the layering. The timing of stages, I'm not sure how much time to give each stage. It's kind of up for grabs. Is this method of teaching generalizable to other studio projects, right? So we've developed it for this one research project, but what about if we took on something else? How could we apply it to that? We need other visualization evidence creation tools for different projects because the one we did for this one isn't going to be good for all of them. So we need to identify more of those. But we also need to think about how do we do it using other research strategies. So this one is just about my research strategy, but there's many others that can be done. How do we implement this kind of evidence-based teaching through other research strategies is an outstanding question. And that's about it. That's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know.
Or comments for Wendy. Let me look at that.
Have you written it up, Wendy?
Well, I've been contemplating a book,
Right.
but I don't know if we've got, because I think, I don't know what the lay of the land is in terms of other research strategies.
Mm.
You know, like Mick follows a different research strategy. You know, maybe he can offer something. I don't know.
Could do different chapters.
Yeah,